Can you use a full frame lens on a crop sensor camera or vice versa? What about those auto crop modes in the camera? How does that affect resolution and field of view? I'm going to go through all of it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everybody, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions right here on Adorama TV. If you've got a photo question, you should know what to do by now. You just go to askdavidbergman.com, submit that form on the site, and I just might pick your question and answer right here on a future show. Today's question comes from Esteban M, who wants to know, if I have my Nikon D850 set to auto DX crop mode, but I'm using my 70-200 lens, will it still crop the image or will it use the full 45 megapixels? Thanks so much for sending that in, Esteban. I do really appreciate it. However, I think that you might be confusing some of the terms because auto DX crop mode only activates when you're using a DX lens, not when you're using your full frame 70-200. You might actually be talking about the image area setting, so let me try to explain how all of this works. Now first, let's talk about what a full frame camera actually is. All that means is that the digital imaging sensor inside the camera body is the same size as a frame of 35mm film. Now, back in the day, 35mm was a very common size of film used by professional still photographers, so it's become the standard for high-end digital cameras of today. Now, cameras like the Canon EOS R3 and the R5 are full frame, meaning that they have sensors that match that 35mm size. Now, the expense of making these big, beautiful sensors does increase the price, so you can also buy bodies with smaller sensors that cost less. Now, this Canon R50, this is the R50 right here, has an aps-c size sensor, which is 22.3 by 14.9 millimeters. Now, if a DSLR or mirrorless camera has a sensor that is smaller than 36 by 24, it's usually called a crop sensor camera. That's because a big difference between full frame and smaller sensors is the crop factor. And when you take a picture, light comes through the lens and projects an image onto the sensor. Now, since the lens has a round aperture, it projects a round image onto the rectangular sensor, and that's the photo that your camera captures. Now, if you use that same lens on a crop sensor camera, the sensor captures a smaller portion of that image. Essentially, it's cropped in from the full frame photo. In some ways, it's like you're using a lens with a longer focal length, since it appears that the final image is zoomed in more on the crop sensor. Now, to get an idea of how much it's actually going to be cropped, you can use a simple calculation. For Canon aps-c cameras like the R7 or the R50, you multiply by 1.6. For Nikon DX cameras and Sony's aps-c bodies, there's a 1.5 crop factor, and Panasonic cameras that use micro four thirds sensors, they have a crop factor of 2 times. Now, I'm using a 16mm lens here on this R50. 16 times 1.6 is 25.6, so it's pretty close to the field of view you'd get from a 24mm lens on a full-frame body like this one right here, my R3. You can see the size difference between these two, right? Now, it can be a big benefit with longer lenses when shooting things like sports and wildlife. That crop factor really can help you out. If you've got a 70-200mm lens and you put it on a Canon aps-c body, it gives you the same field of view as 112-320 without having to pay any extra. Just keep in mind that you do lose some of the wide angle in exchange for longer reach at the telephoto end. I'm going to take a little sidebar here. I'm very specifically saying that it changes the field of view instead of the focal length. Focal length is a fixed property of a lens, and that doesn't change even if you're capturing a smaller portion of the image circle. It may seem just like semantics, and sometimes even the marketing of lenses makes it a bit confusing, but a 24mm lens is always a 24mm lens. You can just capture a different field of view depending on the relative size of the sensor. Okay, so since a smaller area of the image is captured when you have a smaller sensor, you can also buy lenses that are made specifically for crop sensor bodies. They project a smaller image circle, so you don't lose all of that extra light from the full frame lenses. They have smaller optics, which makes them lighter and less expensive. So those small crop sensor lenses can be a way to go. You still need to calculate that crop factor conversion when you're thinking about field of view though, because like I said, the focal length of the lenses doesn't change. Field of view changes only based on the relative size of the sensor. I'm going to say that again. Field of view changes only based on the relative size of the sensor, nothing else. I love that this R50, for example, even though it's aps-c, it uses the same RF mount as all of my full frame bodies like the R3. So I can share lenses between my full frame bodies and with my crop bodies. If I take this 16mm lens off of this R50 and put it on the R3, it's going to look like a 16mm. But on the R50, the field of view is more similar to a 24mm lens, which makes this the perfect everyday carry-around setup for me. This is the one that I keep in my bag at all times, even when I'm not working. Now, if I buy a lens from Canon's RFS line, which those are made specifically for crop sensor bodies, you do still need to do the conversion. So the RFS 18 to 45mm zoom has roughly the same field of view as a 28 to 72. Now, don't think that just because it's a crop sensor lens on a crop sensor body that it's going to look like a full frame 18 to 45. You still need to do that conversion. Okay, so now that we understand what we're talking about here, let me get to the heart of Esteban's question. I think most people would prefer to use full frame lenses on full frame bodies and crop sensor lenses on crop sensor bodies. But practically speaking, you might have some of each and you want to mix and match. Maybe you're like me. I mostly shoot full frame, especially when I'm working professionally, but I picked up the R50 to keep it handy, and I really didn't want to buy a whole bunch of separate RFS lenses since I already have all the full frame lenses that I need. Thankfully, they work on that RF mount on either camera. Now, some camera systems do not allow you to mix and match because that physical mount is different, but some actually do. So using this particular full frame lens on a crop sensor body is no problem. However, the other way around, that's a whole different story. Putting a crop sensor lens on a full frame body means that the image circle isn't actually big enough to fill the entire sensor. If you could see the whole frame, you'd have dark vignetted areas on the sides where no light is hitting. That's obviously not what you really want, so you'd have to crop in on the image in post-processing anyway to get a normal looking horizontal frame. So the camera companies, they've actually tried to help us out in this regard. In the case of Esteban's Nikon gear, their DSLR lenses are split up between FX and DX. FX are full frame and DX are made for cropped sensors. If you put a DX lens onto a full frame body, the camera automatically goes into, yes, DX crop mode. What that does is it only captures the image from the center part of the sensor, essentially cropping the image for you in camera. That's pretty convenient, so you don't have to fix it in post. Now, Esteban asked specifically about using his 70-200 on a full-frame D850 with Auto DX crop mode. Now, I don't know the Nikon line super well, but I don't think they ever made a DX version of the 70-200. He may have been accidentally talking about the DX 70-300, and if that's the case, then yeah, the camera is going to go into DX crop mode and only capture a smaller portion of that sensor, of that image. The field of view is going to be 105 to 540, but the resolution is reduced. The D850 is 45 megapixels with a full frame lens, but it's only 19.4 in Auto DX crop mode. Now, Esteban might have also been referring to using the image area settings in his D850. That's also a crop mode, but different than the Auto DX crop. In the image area settings, you can choose to shoot FX, which is full frame with no crop. You could shoot 1.2 times. You could go DX, which is 1.5 times. You could go 5:4 or 1:1. Now, when you're using a full frame lens on a full frame body, what these settings do is they allow you to crop your image in camera. And yes, because you're capturing a smaller part of the sensor, your resolution is going to be reduced. For example, with your 70-200mm lens, in FX mode, you're using all 45 megapixels, and your field of view is 70-200. If you switch to 1.2 times mode, the field of view becomes 84-240, but the resolution drops to about 31.5 megapixels. And in DX mode, or 1.5 times, you're looking at 105 to 300 millimeters, and your resolution drops down to 19.4 megapixels, just like if you were using a DX lens in Auto DX crop mode. Now, that might sound kind of cool. You're getting this extra reach on that telephoto end, but honestly, I personally think there's very little reason to use those crop modes. It's really the same thing as cropping in post. It's actually exactly the same thing as cropping in post. I'd rather have the flexibility to decide later how much and where I want to crop when I'm editing. I might want to crop in the middle, I might want to crop to the sides, I might want to crop a little bit, I might want to crop a lot. I want to have that flexibility and not lock myself in when I'm shooting. I will acknowledge that there are a couple of minor reasons why you might want to shoot in one of those cropped image area modes. With some cameras, it can give you a faster frame rate because it's only collecting a smaller area of that sensor, or it might increase your buffer performance, which could be helpful if you're shooting action or wildlife and big long bursts pushing your camera to its limit. And if you want to save storage space by shooting smaller files, then sure, that's another valid reason to do so. But for me, if I'm paying for a 45 megapixel camera, I'd rather use all those pixels to shoot and then figure out the crop later. Now, those other two image area options, 5:4 and 1:1, those change the aspect ratio along with the resolution. I can see a few cases where those might be useful. If you're shooting 8:10 headshots, for example, 5:4 is the exact ratio that you'd need, so it could be helpful to see that crop in the viewfinder and avoid extra work in post. The 1:1 option, that gives you a square image, which could be handy if you have a specific reason to shoot squares. I don't know what that would be, but if you shoot squares, then that would be a good way to go. But for most situations, I'd stick with shooting full frame and then cropping later. Now, of course, this all varies a bit between camera models and camera brands, but most have similar options for lenses and image settings. So Esteban, like I said, I think you have your terms a bit mixed up because you can't shoot auto DX crop mode using a full frame lens. That only kicks in when you mount a DX lens on a full frame FX body. Now, since your 7200 is an FX lens, auto DX crop won't activate and you'll get a full frame uncropped image that uses all 45 megapixels. But whether you were referring to using a DX lens on a full frame body, or you're just talking about using an FX lens with the optional DX image area setting, the net result is the same. It will crop your image and it's going to decrease your resolution. I hope that clears up any confusion. What do you all think? Do you mix full frame and crop sensor bodies and lenses? Do you use those in-camera crop modes? Let me know in the comments below. Remember, you can send in your own photo questions by going to askdavidbergman.com. If you like these videos, I do appreciate you hitting that like button. And of course, subscribing to the Adorama YouTube channel. Click that little bell icon so you'll be notified when new shows come out from me and all the other photo hosts right here on Adorama TV. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope to see you next time right here on Ask David Bergman.